Ready to kind of rethink what you think you know about Jewish life in medieval Europe? We're going deeper, going beyond those familiar stories of persecution, and really taking a deep dive into Jewish agency, their ability to shape their own destinies in a predominantly Christian society.
Yeah, it's a perspective that's so often overlooked, right? Like, we just assume medieval Jews were mostly passive victims.
Right.
But the reality is so much more nuanced and honestly inspiring when you really get into it.
For sure. And our guide for this deep dive is going to be NW, How the West Became Anti-Semitic by Ivan G. Marcus. So instead of just talking about, Jewish resilience in the face of adversity, this book argues they were actively shaping their own destinies. What really struck you about that argument?
The book just challenges this notion of Jewish passivity head on. It highlights how they navigated this complicated relationship with Christian society, like pushing back against stereotypes, forging alliances, even challenging the status quo in these really surprising ways.
Okay, so paint the picture for us. We're talking medieval Europe, two religions with a deeply rooted belief in their own chosenness trying to coexist. What were some of those initial points of friction that set the stage for centuries of interaction?
Okay, so imagine this. Both Christianity and Judaism claiming a direct line to God's favor.
Uh-huh.
That's going to cause some theological fender benders right there. This theological clash was a constant source of tension.
Right.
But, and this is fascinating to me, it wasn't all conflict, at least not initially. In the early Middle Ages, you actually see instances of cooperation, even these fascinating business partnerships called marufia. Imagine Jews and Christians working together, building businesses despite their religious differences.
That's so interesting. So it suggests that, pragmatic necessity sometimes just trumped theological differences. But these periods of relative peace didn't last, did they? I imagine as the church's power grew, things shifted.
Absolutely, yeah. As the church consolidated its authority, we really start to see Jewish communities becoming more assertive, almost like a direct response to this growing pressure to conform.
Right.
Imagine, building a life in a new land, you're clinging to your traditions, and then suddenly you feel that identity come under threat.
You'd probably fight tooth and nail to protect that.
Well,
So how did this newfound assertiveness actually manifest? Was it outright rebellion or something more subtle?
it really took many forms. Sometimes it was these subtle acts of defiance, like Marcus describes Jewish merchants refusing to rent ovens to Christians on the Sabbath.
Wow.
Imagine something as mundane as an oven becomes this quiet but potent assertion of their own religious laws, even in a business context.
It's those everyday details that really make history come alive.
Yeah.
But this assertiveness wasn't always quiet, right?
Mm.
The book also talks about Jews openly challenging Christian beliefs. What did those acts of defiance look like?
Sometimes we see instances of Jews using pointed words, symbolic actions, even humor to sort of push back against Christian teachings. For example, the book delves into these accounts of Jews associating Christianity with things considered the opposite of holy, latrines, for instance.
Oh, wow.
It's jarring imagery, but it really speaks volumes about the length some went to express their rejection of the dominant faith.
It's such a visceral image, though, associating something considered so sacred by Christians with something considered so profane by Jews. It makes you realize just how deep this religious divide ran.
It does, and it highlights a crucial point. For these medieval Jews, actions often spoke louder than words. Symbolic gestures and even physical acts of defiance played a significant role in their interactions with the Christian world.
It sounds like this constant push and pull, this need to assert their own identity in the face of pressure, led to some pretty extreme responses on both sides.
Yeah, it did. And unfortunately, some of the darkest chapters in the story, stem from these tensions. One of the most disturbing examples is the rise of the ritual murder accusation.
This is the accusation that Jews used the blood of Christian children in their rituals, right?
Great.
A baseless and horrific claim that has sadly persisted for centuries. How does Marcus even tackle this in the book?
The book traces the evolution of this accusation, revealing just how unfounded it was. And it becomes very clear it reflected deep anxieties within Christian society, far more than any factual basis.
It's tragic how quickly fear and prejudice can twist into something so dangerous. It really makes you question how we combat those kinds of baseless accusations, both in the past and present. But before we delve further into those darker aspects, let's rewind a bit. This assertiveness, this push for a distinct identity, where did it originate? Was it a response to Christian pressure or something deeper rooted in Jewish tradition?
That's a question that really takes us right back to the foundations of Christianity itself, and a figure who played a pivotal role in shaping Christian perceptions of Jews, the Apostle Paul.
Okay, so we're talking New Testament here. For those of us who might be a little rusty on our biblical history, give us the crash course. How does Paul factor into this story of Jewish assertiveness and Christian perceptions?
Paul's letters are really interesting because, he's grappling with this new faith, Christianity, and how it fits in with Judaism, right? So he's arguing that Gentiles, those who aren't Jewish, they can be part of this new covenant with God right alongside the Jews. And on the surface, that might sound pretty inclusive, right?
Right.
But the way he frames it actually lays the groundwork for a lot of the tension and conflict we see playing out later on.
Okay, how so? What's the problem with his argument?
He uses this analogy of two sons, Ishmael and Isaac, to try to illustrate his point.
Okay.
Ishmael, who represents the Jews in this analogy, he's born of a slave woman, while Isaac, representing those who follow Christ, is born of a free woman. So right from the start, it creates this hierarchy, implying that those who follow Christ inherit this greater divine promise.
So it's not just about two faiths coexisting peacefully.
No.
It's about one faith, essentially superseding the other. And how did later Christian thinkers sort of build on this idea?
Yeah, this idea of a hierarchy, it becomes this recurring theme, right? You see it pop up again and again. Like, took Justin Martyr, for example. He's an early Christian apologist. And he's arguing that Jews are really only valuable as witnesses to the truth of Christianity. So their rejection of Christ, in his view, actually ends up proving the validity of Christian beliefs.
Wow. So Jews are essentially relegated to a supporting role in the Christian narrative.
Yeah.
Not exactly a recipe for mutual respect and understanding.
Exactly. And it gets, even more complicated, I guess, with Augustine of Hippo, probably most influential theologian in the Western Church. He really solidifies this image of Jews as these blind witnesses who are just incapable of truly understanding their own scriptures.
So they're trapped in this theological box, defined solely by their relationship to Christianity, not by their own incredibly rich history and traditions.
Yeah, precisely. And what I find so fascinating is that medieval Jews, they were keenly aware of these Christian interpretations. They weren't living in a vacuum.
Right.
Marcus actually mentions a Jewish chronicler writing about how crusaders were taunting Jews during the First Crusade, saying that God had abandoned them and chosen Christians instead.
Oh, wow. So adding insult to injury.
Right.
So they're dealing with all this external pressure from the church, this constant assertion of Christian superiority. And at the same time, they're grappling with how these ideas are shaping their own internal identity. How did they respond to this? Did they just accept these interpretations?
No, not at all. Despite all of this theological pressure, Jewish communities were incredibly resilient. They pushed back, asserted their own beliefs and interpretations, and they did this in some really fascinating ways.
Like what? Give us some examples of how they maintained their own sense of identity in this climate.
One of the most powerful ways was through education. Jewish communities placed a huge emphasis on studying the Torah and Talmud. They wanted to make absolutely sure that their interpretations of their faith, their history, their laws were passed down through the generations.
Right, it's like building this cultural fortress,
Yeah.
A way to protect their identity from being eroded by the dominant culture.
Yeah, exactly. And this wasn't just about individual study either. They built these vibrant intellectual centers, these places where these ideas were debated and passed down to new generations. Marcus even tells this really amazing story about a scholar named Rabbi Meshulam ben Kolonimos who actually disguised himself as a simple student to gain access to a prestigious yeshiva, a Jewish academy in Babylonia.
He went undercover for knowledge. That's incredible. That's dedication.
Right. It just shows you the thirst for knowledge within these communities. And it wasn't just about preserving the past. They were actively engaging in debate, interpreting their faith in all these dynamic ways.
So they weren't just clinging to the past. They were actively shaping their own understanding of their faith, pushing back against these more limiting interpretations.
Absolutely. And this intellectual vibrancy, this engagement, it gave them the tools to really counter those Christian claims and develop their own arguments. It wasn't just about defending their beliefs. It was about shaping their own narrative.
Right. But it wasn't always about words, was it? We talked about these more confrontational acts of defiance.
Yeah.
You mentioned that some Jews even went as far as to, almost insult Christianity. How did that play out in a society where Christianity was the dominant religion?
It's important to remember that for a lot of medieval Jews, Christianity was seen as a form of idolatry, right? A violation of that core Jewish belief in one God.
Right.
And this clash of beliefs led to some really provocative acts of resistance.
Give us an example. What kind of acts are we talking about here?
One of the most striking examples Marcus talks about is this accusation that Jews would deliberately place Christian sacred objects like crosses or Eucharistic wafers in latrines.
Wow, that's such a powerful image. But it seems so shocking, even offensive to us today. What was the message behind an act like that?
For both Jews and Christians at the time, bodily waste, it was considered the ultimate defilement. It represented the opposite of holy.
Right.
So this act, it was a very deliberate rejection of the sanctity of Christian beliefs, a very, I don't know, visceral way of expressing that rejection.
Right. They were drawing a very clear line in the sand,
Yeah.
Using symbolism and actions to challenge the dominant power structure.
Exactly. And this actually leads us to another fascinating aspect of this whole story, the visual. It wasn't just about these theological debates or philosophical arguments. It was about how these different religious groups distinguish themselves in everyday life.
Right. We often have this image of medieval Jews being forced to wear distinctive clothing, like those pointed hats we see in old illustrations. Was that really the case?
Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Yes, visual markers, they were a big deal in medieval Europe, and Marcus actually points to Canon 68 from the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This church council actually mandated that Jews had to wear distinctive clothing to set them apart from Christians.
Wait, hold on. A church council is dictating fashion choices. That's a pretty bold move. What was the reasoning behind that?
It reflects a growing anxiety within the church about the blurring of boundaries between Jews and Christians. They wanted a clear visual separation, a way to maintain a sense of social order.
So it wasn't just about religious differences, it was about power control, right?
Absolutely.
But how effective were these decrees in reality? Did everyone just fall in line?
Not necessarily, no. Interestingly, Marcus points out that the visual reality was often much more complex. Like, telling a Jew from a Christian on the street, it wasn't always easy, especially in these smaller communities where people were interacting all the time.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that.
Yeah.
We have these official pronouncements about clothing and appearances. But in everyday life, those lines might have been much more blurred.
Exactly. And it makes sense, right?
Right.
People don't always fit neatly into these rigid categories.
Of course not.
And this actually leads to another fascinating aspect, how these physical stereotypes started to develop. Marcus explores how physical appearance became intertwined with religious identity.
Okay, so what kind of stereotypes are we talking about here?
For instance, there's this idea that pops up that Jews were inherently dark-skinned and ugly, a stark contrast to the idealized beauty of, fair-skinned Christians.
Wow, so we're reducing entire groups of people to these superficial and honestly completely absurd standards of beauty. Where did these ideas even come from?
Yeah, it's a bit murky, but Marcus suggests they might have emerged, at least in part, from anxieties about Jewish conversion to Christianity.
Really?
Yeah. There was this belief at the time that baptism was transformative, right?
Yeah.
But if a Jew converted and still looked Jewish, it kind of challenged the whole idea that Christianity fundamentally changed a person, on this physical level.
That's fascinating and just incredibly disturbing at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So if physical appearance couldn't be fixed by conversion, it became another way to mark Jews as different, as inherently other.
Exactly. And these visual stereotypes, combined with all those theological ones we talked about earlier, they really played a powerful role in shaping Christian perceptions of Jews for centuries to come.
It's a good reminder that prejudice, it isn't always just about beliefs. It's about power, control, and this really deep-seated human need to create clear categories, even when those categories are based on completely false assumptions.
Absolutely. And it really brings us back to the heart of what we can learn from this history, right? It just underscores the importance of questioning those assumptions, challenging stereotypes, and most importantly, recognizing the humanity of those who are labeled as different. And what's so striking is that we see echoes of these very same prejudices even today. That's what makes this exploration of the past so incredibly relevant.
Couldn't agree more. It's a lesson that transcends any particular period or place. It's like a fundamental aspect of the human condition. So for our listeners out there, as you're going about your day, just consider this. How do you define otherness? And are those definitions based on a genuine understanding of someone different from you, or on these inherited prejudices that we've been talking about? It's a question worth pondering.
Indeed, yeah. And just remember, just as those medieval Jewish communities found ways to assert their own identities and challenge the status quo, we too have the power to push back against those harmful narratives and strive for a more inclusive and understanding world.
That's a powerful thought to leave us with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Jewish assertiveness in medieval Europe. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.